I wrote this book, The Anatomy of Fake News. It came from an idea, and I talk about this in the acknowledgments, but it came from an idea I had actually about 10 years ago when I was considering a dissertation in history. And then, Trump sort of used the phrase and it repopularized the concept of fake news. And I taught a class on it at East Bay, and I used the class basically to create the book. Um, that's a long way of saying that Trump's usage of fake news sort of made this book possible, even though it was a pre existing idea. One of the things I ran into, and this was a great area of frustration for me, is when my book and some articles that were related to it went under double blind review. A lot of scholars told me not to use the phrase fake news. They said that's Trump's phrase. And I was kind of, you know, thunderstruck by the fact that academics were willing to just abdicate a phrase to a president. I think Trump's usage of it is misleading. I think it's propagandistic. I think it's manipulative. And I don't think we should be so quick to hand it over to him. So to answer your question, in some ways, I guess he has monopolized it that even academics feel comfortable not using it. But I, in this book, really take back the phrase to put it grounded in history, to get back to its origin, its purposes, its creators, and its effects.
So this obviously isn't. I mean, it's been more rampant within the past few years, especially with Trump at the helm. But what can you maybe tell us about the first recorded incident of fake news?
I really can't say the first one that's recorded because there's so many, and fake news is so many things, right? It's hoaxes, it's bunks, it's lies, it's misleading information, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but what I did in this book, I do give an international analysis to kind of contextualize how our government creates fake news versus other governments, but I mostly focus on the United States story. And the earliest example I could find in the written record was Christopher Columbus. His arrival in the Americas, which he thought were the Indies, and his account of what was here and what people would experience was an outright lie. We forget that when we look at that, it's not just problematic because he's lying and he's so ethnocentric and he's justifying violence. We forget that he's really kind of the only news base or the only thing that resembles a journalist that informs the so called old world about what exists in the new world. And in that way, his fake news is really powerful because the people who come to the Americas aren't people looking to like, hey, let's, find new cultures or let's, see beauty and wonder and experience. There are people who said, hey, there's gold and slaves here. So if you want gold and slaves, this is the place to go. And that's the type of people and the mentality that it ended up bringing to the new world. So I kind of start with that as my earliest example. It's not really clear that fake news has become more of a problem now than it was in the past. I do a good job in the book of kind of documenting how this has been a problem throughout human history, but it's in particular a problem for democracies because democracies are predicated on people making informed decisions about how to vote, what candidates, what policies, whether or not to protest. So we depend on fact-based information getting into audiences. Fake news is the exact opposite. It can manipulate or persuade people to do things against their interests. That's why it's so problematic for a democracy. Now, obviously, what is different is uh, new tools and mediums themselves are not responsible for fake news, but they do create new opportunities for fake news producers to better weaponize fake news. And whether it be the printing press, the radio, the television, the in-home computer, the digital age, social media, all of these things have found new ways to weaponize and make fake news more effective. I define fake news as any misleading or false content that's introduced as legitimate journalism or news. And I use that definition because it allows us to go into a sort of like broader space in talking about fake news than, say, like the Donald Trump definition, where Trump uses it to say that anything he finds problematic is fake. Also, a lot of like scholars have only focused on like social media when they say fake news, but my definition allows us to look at like the totality of fake news, and I think that raises kind of the possibility of developing solutions that actually target fake news once we can address it in its totality. But what Trump has a unique ability to do, and this is grounded in the history of fake news, is you manufacture a crisis. You tell people that some crisis is either happening or going to happen, and you hammer it into people where they're convinced of it to the point that they act upon it. That is, it doesn't really matter if someone's trying to steal the election. What does matter is whether or not the electorate believes someone's trying to steal the election. And so Trump has created this story that liberals through the post office are going to steal the election in that sense, right? That could act as a force that could manipulate the election. Simultaneously, liberals are greatly concerned now that Trump is going to try and steal the election by defunding the Postal Service. He has made rhetorical statements that do imply that he does want to defund the Postal Service, and that thus the possibility is real that it could affect the outcome of the election. So yeah, there's the analysis I have in the book fits well with this. This is how what these moral panics or what I go into in the book are created. And I go into detail about sort of how they were created around like slavery in the middle of the 19th century. And what's confusing in a situation like this, as was then, is you're dealing, and this is what makes the most fake news the most effective. You're dealing with pieces of real elements, but you're drawing things you can't prove off of them, and that's a really powerful tool because people feel like it's real because it has some real elements, and you then appeal to like very strong reactionary emotions like fear and anger, and that's what Trump is doing with the scaring of with the fear over the theft of the election, and same thing with liberals. So it's a perfect kind of scenario for fake news to thrive in that environment. Um, you're much better to wake up every day and use maybe like four or five pieces of news rather than scroll through every news outlet, read every headline, and share everything you agree with. You really need to spend some serious time analyzing each individual piece of content. So if you're going to take on an issue like Black Lives Matter, as you point out, there's a litany of issues surrounding it. Who started the movement? How is the movement nationally? How is it locally? Who opposes it? Why do they oppose it? What actions are they taking on the ground? What behaviors and attitudes do members of it demonstrate? What behaviors and attitudes do people demonstrate that are not associated with the movement? You can't begin to answer those questions on an individual level. You're going to need to depend on all the journalists who are in all these different cities where all these different Black Lives Matter, for better word, chapters are. And so you have to go to the news content. And when you go to the news content, you analyze the piece itself. So what is the message that the piece of content is trying to send? Who is the content's publisher? What's their history and ideological bias? Who's the journalist? What's their identity and ideological bias, and how does it maybe frame the piece? Then when you get into the piece, what is the evidence that is provided? Is the evidence sufficient? Is there perhaps countervailing views that are not represented equally? These are all the sort of questions you need to ask when you're approaching news content. If the answer is no, or if it's a problematic answer to any of those, you should be very skeptical of believing it, but definitely be skeptical of sharing it, because if you share content that's fake, you're part of the fake news problem. So we need to really, really spend some time with that. So the conclusion that Black Lives Matter is a violent Marxist movement, that would take a ton of evidence to prove that. You would need to have a lot of Marxist rhetoric being practiced. You need to demonstrate that in all these different chapters. You would need to demonstrate all of the violence was behind people. So that means you need to do like profiles of each individual and make sure they're associated with the movement and not a white supremacist group, as you point out. Um, and that would take a lot of journalism. So I would say, there would have to be a litany of well-sourced articles for me to draw that conclusion.
How do you tell? How can we tell? As public who probably doesn't spend this much time doing research on information, how can we tell if a news source is reputable?
Yeah, so it's a long. I'm not going to lie, it's a long journey. That is, I provide in the book basic skills you can start to use, but over time, what you want to do is start to build a relationship with journalists. Fox kind of championed this loyalty to a news brand. That is really problematic. So I would not be loyal to a news brand. I would start to follow journalists who do great work that is transparent journalism, journalists who are not afraid to say things or conclude things based on evidence that's unpopular, but do it in a transparent way where you can check their sources. And again, you do that kind of taking the steps I was talking about before. Anytime you see a piece of content, who is the publisher? Does this publisher have a history of publishing fake news? And there's some fact checking websites that can kind of give you an indication of that, like a Snopes or PolitiFact. Fair.org does some great work in helping with this stuff. And if the outlet has a long history of publishing fake news, that doesn't necessarily mean the article is fake, but it should raise your skepticism. And then do the same fact checking websites when it comes to the journalist as well. What is the history? What is the evidence provided to discount this journalist, if there's any out there? Do you find it convincing? And then you get into the article itself. What is the evidence they provide? What views do they include? Always ask yourself what views are not included. Just whether it be a political party or an identity group, an economic perspective, whatever it is. Why aren't those in there? So once you start to develop that, you can start to figure out who are reputable journalists. And it still doesn't mean you should blindly trust them, but at least means if you're going to limit yourself to using content that you trust, you can start gravitating toward those journalists rather than look at everything. A good way to kind of good like rules that I don't talk too much like specifically about in the book, but they're definitely insinuated. I would just not watch 24-hour news. At this point, they don't really have any journalists hired. They sometimes bring on journalists to be interviewed, but it becomes an opinion piece. So I would get rid of 24-hour news personally. Your social media, I would seriously limit its use, and I would encourage you to get rid of your social media account. There's a whole talk in the book about the economics behind social media and why that is. Uh, and also remember why we have a free press in the first place. One of the first chapters of the book, I don't start talking about fake news. I start talking about what is news, because before you can recognize fake news, I think you need to understand what is journalism. And so I say, the journalism, here's what it is. And I go into what journalists are supposed to do in their code of ethics, but I also go into the purposes of journalism, which is journalism exists and we subsidize it as a country and we gave freedom of the press as a constitutional right because the founders believed that as long as we had a free and vibrant press, truth would be out there. And I still agree with them on that. Where I disagree with them is their contention that if truth is out there, more people will recognize truth than falsehood. And I think recent years have demonstrated that's not the case. We need skills to decipher truth from falsehood. But in the book, my argument would be learn what journalism is and seek out journalists who are doing actual journalism, and cut all the rest of that fake news, opinion editorial, hyper partisanship from your news diet. It's not doing you any good. We've lost the ability to talk with one another. And I hear this all the time, right? Like, I can't talk to so and so, or how do you talk to so and so? It's difficult, it's possible, and we have to figure it out. You have to be able to talk to people. And I think one of kind of the really important kind of basic lessons that we can learn from communication is you really have to talk to people where they're at if you want to get through to them. And so, you know, do I think that everyone should already by this point in life understand structural racism and sexism? Of course. But some people don't. And I can either mock them for it or I can try and reach them where they're at to get them to understand why it's what it is, why it's a problem, what to do about it. And the same thing goes with fake news. If you sit there and mock people for believing something that's completely false, you're not getting through to them. You're turning them off talking to you, believing in you, or listening to you. So it takes a delicate approach of saying, I'm not judging you or mocking you. I just, I think there's some serious questions about what you're saying. And so I always like to take the questions approach. So if someone tells me, what's it like I don't know, I read the other day that Barack Obama is a Kenyan socialist sent to destroy America. I'm like, wow, I hadn't heard that. What's the evidence for that? Who reported it? And it's a good way to plant in people's minds the questions they should be asking. Now, and I've been in similar scenarios, believe it or not, the person will not right away uh, tell you, "Oh, you're totally right. I should have asked those questions. Never mind." Generally, what they do is they go home and they ask the questions, or they'll consider the questions in the future. So you kind of met them where they're at. You said you're a person who doesn't question content. Um, but maybe you should, and maybe you've started the process of getting them to think. So that's my suggestion: is getting people comfortable with the idea of asking basic questions. um, I think also a way you can do that is you have to create a persona, if you will, of someone who is not afraid to criticize or ask questions or shoot down things that would be politically convenient for yourself. So I do this a lot in public talks, and during the Obama years, I was called like a secret Republican because I would always be critical of like news about Obama and things like that. During the Trump years, I've been called a liberal shill who's just anti-Trump. But regardless of who's in power, I think we should get comfortable in asking questions. You kind of build credibility as someone who's known for questioning power structures, whether they're true or false. So those are ways you can have self-reflection to build a strong reputation, credibility. But there are also ways you can reach people where they're at when it comes to fake news. And I think all of that's really critically important for creating like strong democratic discourse. Do you think there is a way to restore the public's faith in news outlets, especially when people in like the highest offices are discrediting them? And this is kind of a fascinating topic. So I like to come at it from kind of two different angles. One angle is that you shouldn't really look at Trump as necessarily being the cause of a lack of faith in news media. Instead, you should recognize there was such a lack of faith in news media that Trump's rhetoric about news media could resonate.
Mhm.
And that lack of faith, I personally believe, is well founded. I mean, a lot of these so-called reputable news sources were the ones behind. You can go back and look at like the consensus around Vietnam, but more recently, they're the ones who got the Iraq War wrong. They're the ones who got the election results in 2016 wrong. They're the ones who got the 2008 financial collapse wrong. And so, in a lot of ways, they've built up a reputation of not being trustworthy. However, that's also kind of misleading in the sense that not every journalist at every news outlet is responsible for all of those stories. So that's why I say it's crucial to hunt out journalists who are doing great work rather than sort of depend on these news outlets. One of the other problems with what we found in a recent study is that when someone calls a news outlet, when someone in power calls a news outlet fake, even if I don't believe it or you don't believe it, studies find it still influences our belief and skepticism about that news source. So even people who believe in the news source become more skeptical of the news source when it's called fake. Now, granted, that could be healthy skepticism, but nonetheless, it's a really scary thing that just by calling fake, people have decided to turn off all news media rather than kind of search out fact based journalism.
So, of everything that a person can do, doing research, finding reputable news sources, what would you say of all the things a person needs to do, especially a member of the public? What is the one thing everyone can do to better arm themselves against being fooled by fake news?
Well, one of the things I mean, in the most basic sense, is asking questions. Like question all the content you come into contact with, especially question content when it makes you really happy. A lot of the way the internet economy works is it tries to prey upon your behaviors and attitudes. And I talk about this in the book that the economy of the internet is one of collecting people's data from all these different sources, your likes, clicks, shares, facial recognition software, where you drive, your GPS, all this stuff, and then creating a psychographic profile of your likes, your dislikes, and all of related feelings. And the reason why that's so lucrative is because advertisers want to use that data to customize content, to prey upon your feelings, to hopefully nudge your behavior, if not direct your behavior when it comes to purchasing things. Well, political campaigns have learned how to do this. Governments have used this data. We know our government works with a lot of these big Silicon Valley corporations to collect data. And so they create fake content to shift what you do. So limiting your digital footprint can be a major way, but also when you are online, be skeptical of the content you encounter. Um, they design the content to make you feel confirmed in your views. Studies find we like to feel confirmed online. If we're confirmed, we keep clicking, liking, and sharing. So if you like something, there's probably a strong chance it was customized and it was easy to convince you to like it, even though it might not be true. So double investigate when it's something that you feel good about. And also when it seems like it's totally out of left field, you also want to investigate when it seems crazy. But the moral of kind of the story is just question everything, ask questions, do research, do it on your own, and have faith in your own abilities. Sometimes you may get to a conclusion that is unpopular in your political circle, whatever it may be, a liberal or conservative. But that's okay. It's better to be accurate than to be liked.